Hi, I'm Stephanie Lemick, and this is Building Trauma Informed Workplaces. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a concept called institutional betrayal. I do want to go ahead and offer a content warning. I will make references to sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual abuse during our conversation. While I won't go into extreme detail, we will be referencing it. So please be aware and make sure you're taking care of yourself first and foremost. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. So, if you've never heard of the concept of institutional betrayal, it's not surprising. It's not a super common term, but it's also something that is unfortunately quite common and has a significant impact on our workplaces and also just in our organizations that we belong to overall. It is something that has come into much greater prominence following the Me Too movement when it became clear that a vast majority of organizations focused on protecting that organization and even perpetrator of alleged abuse versus supporting and protecting survivors. And there are unfortunately numerous examples of how this comes up. What I want to do today is talk through the concept of institutional betrayal overall, what impact it has on individuals and on workplaces, and what we can do to move past institutional betrayal to something even greater. I'm really excited because I had a chance to speak briefly at the Phoenix Disrupt HR about institutional betrayal a few weeks ago. So I'm excited to share this and share a little bit more detail about the topic as well. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know I'm big on definitions. So let's start with a definition of institutional betrayal. Institutional betrayal refers to the harm or betrayal experienced by individuals when the institutions or organizations to which they belong failed to prevent, respond to, or acknowledge the misconduct or harm perpetrated within their ranks. This can involve situations where institutions neglect or cover up issues such as abuse, discrimination, harassment, and other forms of misconduct. In many ways, institutional betrayal, the harm experienced by institutional betrayal, mirrors those feelings, those experiences we may have when we experience individual betrayal. So if you've ever felt betrayed by a loved one, a friend, a coworker, think of that as an example of some of the feelings, some of the psychological impacts that may come along with institutional betrayal. And something that's really important to call out is the fact that institutional betrayal creates a second separate psychological injury. So, if you've experienced harm perpetrated by someone within your organization, and then the organization fails to react or respond in an appropriate way, you experience a second psychological injury separate from that first experience. So, this is a big deal. This has wide ranging implications, especially when we reflect on the goal of becoming a trauma informed workplace. We know one of the things we're looking to do is actively minimizing harm and avoiding traumatizing survivors. In the case of institutional betrayal, there's a strong probability that we're failing in both of those categories by failing to respond in an appropriate way. To give a little context on the concept of institutional betrayal is a term coined by Dr. Jennifer Freyd. She is a psychologist and researcher. And in her research, specifically around examples of sexual harassment, sexual assault, she found that organizations tended to look to protect themselves, protect perpetrators versus appropriately address harm. And a common way organizations either deliberately or without realizing push back is by using something referred to as DARVO, a strategy called DARVO, which stands for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. And this strategy is frequently used to shift blame and accountability and focus from the accused back to the accuser. Um, this is something you may see come up in the concept of victim blaming, or, when you think of a sexual assault trial, how oftentimes the sexual assault survivor is having to go in detail about their sex life, what they were wearing, what they were drinking, different behaviors, versus actually addressing the specific harm done to that individual. So this was something that Dr. Freud discovered, and its impacts on the workplace are significant. When we think about harm done within the workplace, there are a whole bunch of ways this could happen. As a former HR professional, I kind of think of those things that would come up in a traditional employee relations investigation. So that might be allegations of harassment or discrimination. It could also be issues of sexual harassment in the workplace. It could also be bullying or different things, toxic management, toxic stress. And oftentimes, that harm, before it's escalated to HR, to a leader, to a manager, that harm has already been done. So a harm has already occurred in cases of institutional betrayal. And that secondary harm is the response of the organization. And it's important to consider when we say the response of the organization, most organizations aren't moving in the same direction all the time, all of our leaders. So a representative of the organization, their response is what can key into whether or not that individual feels appropriately supported or if there is that additional injury of institutional betrayal. So that could be an HR representative, that could be a manager or leader, that could be a frontline supervisor. So really important as we think about, preventing this additional harm, preventing this additional risk and exposure within our organizations. How prepared, how empowered are those individuals who are representing the behavior of the organization to prevent institutional betrayal? Becomes very important to think about that because we won't always be the one initially addressing these concerns. Another way to consider some of the workplace impact, obviously, trauma responses may show up with any of the harms initially experienced, but because it is a second harm, there can be additional trauma responses and reactions that show up related to the impact of institutional betrayal. And I will say this can also especially exacerbate feelings of trauma or traumatic experiences. It can be re triggering for individuals who have already felt harmed by other organizations, other institutions, aspects of society where there are very clear power imbalances or issues of discrimination. So this can be particularly challenging when we think about impacts it may have on traditionally marginalized communities. Another really big issue to tackle here is when you are in a moment where you experience institutional betrayal, really this is going to completely break or erode the experience of trust that employee has for the organization, for leadership. And oftentimes they're going to feel very unsupported. And it is going to create long term impacts on engagement, morale, and retention. So, if you think about engagement, if you have an engaged employee who experiences sexual harassment, for example, in the workplace, and then upon reporting that harassment, the response is poor, and then now they experience institutional betrayal, there is very little hope that that individual is going to remain highly engaged. There is negative impacts as it relates to that individual's ability to continue to do their job and do it well. And likely there may be retention issues. I also think it's really important to acknowledge when we ignore harm going on in our workplace, of course, there is the direct impact to those who are experiencing the harm directly. But oftentimes within organizations, we also see what is happening around us. So when others see harm being perpetrated or others experiencing harm and failure for there to be an effective response, that can also have impacts on others who may not be directly harmed by that initial traumatic experience, by that initial misconduct within your organization. So this could come up with, trust issues, retention issues, engagement issues within other teams, other employees within your workplace. So it can create a really systemic issue around how your team, how your culture is interacting. It can also crop up as secondary trauma for other team members, whether they witnessed or that team member is sharing their experience. This can also create an experience of secondary trauma, either the harm or the misconduct itself, or also the issue of institutional betrayal. So, really important to understand that it's easy to think of this challenge of betrayal being, the organization and the one individual who's been harmed, but it actually can become rather broad and wide reaching, even in a single instance. And when we know that our organizations, our leaders aren't prepared to handle this challenge that comes up, well, more often than not, they're probably mishandling things more than one time. So this becomes a cycle where an organization is doing harm. It's re-traumatizing survivors. It's triggering, challenges where there are real repercussions as it relates to someone's mental health, but also as it relates to someone's ability to do their job, do it well, and also the overall organization's ability to function and continue to be productive when we look at the impacts on engagement and retention. So, if you're anything like me, you're learning about institutional betrayal and thinking, wow, that sucks. And it does. Institutional betrayal is incredibly harmful for everyone involved. And I would say it's incredibly harmful for organizations and businesses as well. It is a big deal, it is a big challenge. And, in this conversation, I'm quite focused on the employee employer relationship and how institutional betrayal can pop up. But really, any stakeholder of an organization can experience institutional betrayal. That could be your customers, your communities, any of your shareholders, stakeholders. So, this is something that is an absolute concern and we should be thinking about, we should be talking about. So, your next question is probably what can we do instead of institutional betrayal? Or what might the opposite of institutional betrayal be? And that's institutional courage. And that refers to the willingness of an organization to actively listen to, validate, and address the harm within their systems. It sounds a lot like trauma informed workplaces because a lot of what we're doing in a institutionally courageous organization is that principle of humility and responsiveness. We're listening to, we're validating, and we're addressing harm within our organization in a proactive way. And something that's amazing is Dr. Jennifer Freyd, who coined the term institutional betrayal and institutional courage. She also founded the Center for Institutional Courage. And really, what this is it is the information that this is a great place to find information, new research around institutional courage across organizations. You can make a pledge to join on institutional courage. You can share and learn more about Darvo, how to understand patterns, understand different research and its impact. So there's a lot of amazing information around institutional courage, research, and education that's available. I've linked the website in the show notes. Highly recommend checking it out. Great information available. And certainly, they've done a lot of work with a whole host of different organizations and institutions, including working with folks who were part of the Me Too movement that really did prompt a lot of this conversation around institutional betrayal and institutional courage. So, when you think about institutional betrayal and institutional courage within your own organization, let's think about some examples of what that might look like. So, it could be proactively addressing mental health challenges, harassment, and discrimination within your workplace. Do you have policies and procedures to do that? Do all of your frontline managers know what the correct thing to do is, how to respond, how to tag in the appropriate person to help? One thing I did at a point in my career is knowing that a lot of our frontline leaders would not know what to do in some really high stakes situations. I focused on training them on when to recognize, when to wave their red flag or their yellow flag and tag me in so I could help support. We don't have to make sure every single one of our supervisors or managers knows how to handle everything. But when we make sure they're able to tag in the right resources, the right person to help resolve an issue appropriately, that is going to be a huge help to help avoid issues of institutional betrayal. Another great way to look at creating institutional courage versus betrayal is being transparent about institutional policies, organizational policies and procedures, and encouraging open communication channels. That way, if some harm is occurring, there are ways to proactively either avoid that harm or mitigate it quickly. And it's also important that leaders are held accountable and there is organizational transparency in failures or missteps. This is not a fun thing most of the time. None of us love being wrong. None of us love making mistakes. But when leaders showcase accountability, when they take accountability and address missteps, wrongs, especially when those harms impact individuals, it is so important and it creates a very clear understanding of the culture of how missteps of how harm will be addressed and create a culture where people feel they can bring things forward and they will be addressed appropriately. Because also consider you want to proactively telegraph that you are interested in supporting your team members and addressing issues of harm. Because this is such a widespread issue, many of your team members may be coming from organizations where this is not a priority. And they may be coming from situations where they may have even experienced institutional betrayal in a previous role. So that can have an impact. That can be trauma from the workplace that they're bringing with them into their new role. So that can be something that you may be working against as you're looking to build that sense of institutional courage within your organization. I hope from this conversation and this very high level discussion of the concept of institutional betrayal and institutional courage that you're excited to address this within your organization, whether it's your workplace, your church, a youth group, a book club, any kind of organization or institution you are part of. I highly recommend making a commitment and working towards that sense of institutional courage. There are a lot of great resources available, especially from the Center for Institutional Courage. But some things to think about at a high level to address and what you can do, today or relatively easy in the next few months is make sure you're looking at your policies and practices as an organization. You have clear policies in place, ideally trauma informed policies to address complaints and ensure employee safety, security, that we're minimizing that sense of harm. This is also a great place to engage in some training and awareness. We want to make sure we're engaging in regular training around issues like harassment, discrimination, mental health challenges, resources for our employees and leaders so folks know how to respond and prevent harm. So they are empowered to do so or have the right resources available to them to take the right action. Because a lot of times there may be the right resources, but if your frontline supervisors don't know how to access them, really it may not end up the way we want. And we may not see a positive response or that institutional courage we're hoping for. We've got to make sure there's leadership buy in and accountability for a culture of institutional courage. The role of leaders is setting the tone and maintaining that sense of institutional courage. So that buy in is going to be super important. If you are, an HR partner, an HR leader, a member of an executive team, I would start with your executive peers on making sure they understand, what is institutional betrayal, what is institutional courage, and gaining their buy-in on making this a priority and then building out a plan from there. And, this one's tough, but it includes leaders taking accountability for harm and addressing mistakes that they've made and being transparent around that. So that can be tricky, but really it is incredibly powerful to do so. And last but certainly not least, we don't understand when harm is occurring if we're not listening to the members of our organization, if we're not listening to our employees. So we want to make sure that we're building systems and processes and a culture that encourages employees to speak up, and to do so in a way that feels safe, psychologically safe, physically safe, financially safe for them, that there will not be repercussions for reporting abuse or harm. This could be anonymous reporting tools, it could be a hotline of some kind, it could be tiered reporting relationships. There are so many options to engage in active employee listening, both for, very clear harm, but also for those warning signs of, potential misbehavior, potential toxic management, overwhelming stress. Because while those may not be, very egregious harms, those things can be signs of potential for them. And they're also signs that things are not going well and that we want to address. So make sure you're hearing from your team members and then taking actionable steps to address those concerns as they're coming up. Institutional betrayal is tricky and it can seem overwhelming, but I promise investing in institutional courage, making sure you're listening to your team members, actively engaging in rectifying harm, and making sure there are avenues for people to express their concerns, report misdeeds, in a way that can be addressed appropriately. And of course, giving your team members the tools and resources to do so well can really set your organization apart and move from institutional betrayal, which causes a lot of harm both to individuals and the organization, to institutional courage. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Until next time, be well.